So we usually do these tech chats. Well, we do them every quarter, and a lot of times we talk about what we did during the keynotes and our demos and things like that. And I like the tech chat because I feel like it's an informal time for us to kind of just talk about the way that we tend to do things and put code together, which is always interesting to me to see what other people do. But, and I think, let me share my screen here. Show my screen. Yeah, still showing my screen. I think that one of the really neat things that happened in Q2 or Q1, excuse me, was the SPA framework that that we put out with that release. But there's a lot of other stuff that's been happening in Q2, specifically with Angular, and I know Derek, you've been doing some Backbone stuff, and so I kind of thought that now is like a really good time for us to talk about the Kendo UI SPA, what it is, what its features are, what its strengths are, and then also talk about Kendo UI in the context of Backbone and Angular. And I know we're going to leave a bunch out. Several people have asked about Durandal.
Right.
We don't have a Durandal expert. I did try to recruit Ray Bango to talk about Ember, but he was out late at a Pitbull concert last night, so he's not going to be able to make it this morning, but we won't miss him. I know, right? So Derek, I thought we could just start with you. I know that you've done a lot of work with the Kendo UI SPA the last quarter. You blogged a lot about it, specifically about the different components.
Yep.
And I thought we could just go and maybe you could show us around the Kitty Gallery. And I know I definitely have some questions about the Kendo UI SPA framework. So you want to go ahead and share your screen? Let's see if there's anything I can do here. Let me see. I'm going to change the presenter to you. So, Derek, let's go ahead and talk about the different pieces of the Kendo UI SPA framework. And I just want to kind of start and ask you, what exactly is a SPA? I think that's a term that's overused, and I'm not really sure that I understand exactly what constitutes a SPA.
Sure. So there's a couple of different things. A SPA is kind of a generic term for a highly interactive web application that doesn't do a complete refresh from the server in order to show new content. SPA is single page application, which I know is a very nebulous term in itself. I mean, what is a single page and what is an application? Those are two very nebulous things. But the idea is that you have an application that can show a lot of different things on the screen and change the content on the screen without having to do a complete server refresh in order to re-render everything on the server. And I have a good example of a SPA built with our Kendo UI SPA components here, which is the Kitty Gallery application. And the Kitty Gallery application is a really simple image gallery that I use in all my demos and blog posts and everything. Let me zoom this in, make sure people can see. But it's a simple demo that shows some of the basics of a single page application. And I know a lot of people are going to look at this and say, well, that's just a highly interactive website with JavaScript, and they're exactly right. That's all that a single page application is. It's really just a highly interactive web page that happens to have different areas of functionality and different screens that it can show and different layouts that it can show, all just done with JavaScript through a number of different frameworks, or even just hand rolling some JavaScript and jQuery if you want to. So with this little application, I can click on one of my images here and I can see the image showing up. And it's doing this all through JavaScript, of course. It's not doing a server refresh. You can even see that the URL isn't changing at all. And I can come in here and I can add another kitty. And then I can put in a placekitten address, placekitten.com/300/202. And it gives me a preview of the image, and when I click save, it adds that image with apparently a different preview, which is pretty awesome.
So you gotta love placekitten. That was
gotta love placekitten giving me a different image from one second to another. So this is a really simple application that allows me to switch screens essentially between the Add Kitty form and viewing the kitties as I'm clicking through each of these. Um, One of the things that really sets apart a highly interactive page from a real true SPA, as much as we can say a real true SPA, is the idea that you can use the forward and backward buttons in your browser as if you were going back to the server and back out to the browser every time you changed. And I don't have the high quality version of the Kitty Gallery set up, but I do have another version of it on JS Fiddle here that has the routing in place. So let me zoom
You
this
want to
in
copy
as
that link
well.
into the chat there just for everybody in case people just want to get onto JS Fiddle and
Yeah, let me do that real quick. Here is, that's the link to this specific JS fiddle, and if you take the word show off of the end of this URL, you'll get to the full URL where you can actually play with the JS fiddle.
beautiful.
So this version of the Kitty Gallery, when I click on one of these images, you'll see that the URL does update. It goes to /images/2 or /1, 2, 3, 4, and it's doing all of this without doing a server refresh. I mean, I don't have a server in this case. It's JS Fiddle. It's not like JS Fiddle has an API that I can go to and get my Kitty data off of. So this is all running right here in the browser, but I can still use the forward and back buttons in my browser, and you'll see the URL changing as I do that. So
So
this is
you're
called routing. This is part of every single page application framework out there that allows you to do routing on the client side, not just on the server side.
is it safe to summarize and say that a single page application is really an application that swaps out pieces of the page or the HTML without
Mm-hmm.
making a refresh to the server?
Right, and on top of that, provides routing in the client application so that you can use your browser's forward and back button in order to change pages essentially without having to do a complete server refresh.
So let's talk about a little bit about the Kendo UI SPA and it's kind of comprised of a couple of different pieces. So let's talk about, I guess a good place to start would be the view. Tell us about
Right.
the view portion.
So a view in Kendo UI's SPA is a very, very lightweight object, honestly. In my code here, you can see that I have several views set up. And these views are really little more than specifying a template to render for the view and specifying a view model to bind into that view. So in Kendo UI, we have what's called the MVVM pattern, model view, view model. And there's a lot of different variations of these MV star patterns. But the model view, view model pattern allows us to have really easy data binding between a view model and the view template itself. It gives us all of the data and the view behavior for that data inside of the view model. So when I have a Kendo observable object here for the add image screen, which you can see, which one was it? The add image screen is this right here. I have this Kendo observable view model, which contains my name and URL, which are the inputs right here. And then I have the save clicked, which is the button click when I click save right here. And all of this is the view model, so it contains the behavior and the data for the view. The view itself is the add image form, which points to a template. I specify the view model as the model for this view, and then of course the actual template, which I have. Let me show you the HTML version, which is just standard HTML, and we happen to use Kendo UI's rendering engine behind the scenes in order to get this HTML into the screen. So an interesting thing about Kendo UI's view object is that everything it does for us was already possible in Kendo UI, but it took a lot more code that you had to write yourself. So the view rendering, the model binding, the management of getting information into and out of the DOM and getting the specific view instance into the DOM or out of the DOM. All of that was possible with just the MVVM setup, but it required a lot more code on your part to manage all of those individual pieces. So what we
So
did, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, how exactly are you getting this HTML into the page? Because I see you're referencing it by name, but what
Right.
mechanism is actually getting it into the main page?
So
Which
there's
I
two different,
assume,
sorry, go
where
ahead.
is your main page, by the way?
My main page for this sample application is actually this is a Express.js file with Jade as the actual HTML layout. This I know looks odd and funny. It's not real HTML, but it produces HTML, kind of like CoffeeScript to JavaScript. Uh, so it gives me the basic layout, but then I have individual templates that I've specified in script tags here with a type that says this is a template, and then an ID that I'm using to select inside of the actual JavaScript file.
I got it. So when your application fires up, it loads those templates into the page.
Into
They're
the DOM
templates.
itself.
They're inside script tags, but
Right,
their type is text Kendo template. And then when the view gets rendered,
right.
it loads up that template, and then it applies the view model, binds the two together, and renders the output to where?
To where I want it to, and I'll show you that in a second. But just to illustrate everything that you said, so this add image form template identifier here directly translates back to this HTML here, and I can find the add image form template
There it is.
right here, and this is all of the HTML that gets rendered into the template. The previous one that I showed you was an already rendered version of it that I had saved for demonstration purposes. So what it does is it takes this identifier, finds this chunk of script code here as a template, and then when I need this, I can call a render function on this add image form and produce the HTML that I want. So I can say add image form dot render, and that produces the output HTML, and then at this point it's just a string, so I could do whatever I wanted and stuff this HTML directly into the body of the document, for example. But the other thing that we have on top of views is what we call a layout. And a layout is a lot like a master page in ASP.NET MVC or ASP.NET Web Forms, or a layout in Ruby on Rails. It gives us the ability to have a larger page layout with different areas of the screen that can have different pieces swapped in and out. So I've got a layout that represents this whole screen, and I have a region of the layout for this image list at the top, and then I have a region of the layout for the main display area, which is where I'm swapping the image viewer versus the add image form in and out. And that's done using a layout here. Now, a layout is just a Kendo view that also gives us this show in method. And the show in method takes a DOM element that the layout contains, and it allows us to show a specific view inside of that DOM element. So instead of having to manually render this add image form and populate that HTML output into the DOM myself, I can just tell my layout to show my add image form in the main content area of the DOM, and it does that for me. So every time
And
I refresh this page, it starts out putting the add kitty form in the DOM because it's being told to right here.
so and the main, of course, is just the ID of a div somewhere in the layout.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
the layout essentially, I guess, then gives you is in charge of swapping out your different templates and portions of the view in the HTML so that you don't have to
Exactly.
manually take care of that.
Exactly. And this is the HTML output for my layout right here. So I've got a header, I've got the main content section, I've got the image list, and right here is the article ID main, which is what I'm specifying inside of the JavaScript right here. So this is my jQuery CSS selector to find this main article element and populate the content into that main element.
I gotcha. So let's talk lastly about the router and take a look at that code just a little
Sure.
bit.
So the router, like I said, and like I showed here, allows the individual pages, quote unquote, to be allows you to move back and forth between the individual pages using both code to click an image and view it, or the browser's forward and back button. The great thing about SPA routers in JavaScript is they don't really do anything new in terms of the browser. There's a couple of exceptions to that, but in reality, they're just taking advantage of this hash fragment at the end of a URL, which has been around since like HTML, HTTP 4. Or HTML 1.0, I think. It's been here forever, for 15 or more years, and this hashtag at the end of a URL used to be used for named links. You would have a bunch of menu items at the top of a page, like an index or an outline or something, and you would click on one, and it would point to a named location within the document, and then your browser would just scroll down to that location automatically. Well, we took advantage of this in all of the different routers out there for Backbone and Ember and Kendo UI and Angular and everything else. We take advantage of that, knowing that the browser will not refresh the page. It will simply travel to the location that is specified with this hash fragment. So what we do is, using that old technology in combination with a newer technology, uh, with JavaScript being able to pay attention to events and being able to populate this information ourselves, we can update the URL's hash fragment whenever we click on one of these images, in order to know that image 3 is this image right here, image 2 is this image right here. And then updating the hash fragment in the browser allows each of these individually to be pages that you can move forward and backward between, because the browser already knows how to handle hash fragments like that.
So what exactly happens when you travel to images/2? Like what's going on in the
Let me show you
code?
the code for that, and I'll have to zoom out a little so I can show you. So I've got a basic setup with some hard-coded data in here. I've got a view model set up. I've got some actual views and a layout. But then down here is where I have the router. And this is about the easiest example of a router that you can imagine. Like an ASP.NET MVC or Ruby on Rails route, or Backbone for that matter, I specify a route that I want called /images, and I give it a :ID as an identifier for a variable in the URL. So this is pretty standard stuff when you're talking about server-side MVC or any kind of other MVC, in terms of creating a variable. This gives me the knowledge of, okay, look for the hash fragment /images /some ID. And once it hits that ID, it runs this little function here, which I then take my kitty model, my view model, and I call show by ID, passing in the ID which came from the URL, and the show by ID function then loads the correct image out of my data source and shows it in the actual DOM in this case.
So it's similar to, I guess, MVC routing with the way that you have parameters on the URL, and then those
Exactly.
parameters are available to you as variables in the function that gets
Exactly.
called. Okay.
So every time I click forward and backward on in my browser here, it's changing the route in the hash fragment here, and our router is paying attention to that change so that it can fire off this route function here and show the image in the screen.
All right, very nice. Well, I think everybody's got I mean, we have the URL there in the to the entire audience. Yeah, it's got the fiddle in it, so people can pull that up. I want us to
Mm-hmm.
switch gears for a minute and talk a little bit about Backbone, because I know that
Sure.
Kendo UI SPA is a combination of handling views and swapping out pieces of the HTML for you, but it also has the added benefit of adding in our two-way binding, and so you kind of get both. You get
Right.
the management of the DOM, and you also get the two-way binding, so you only have to keep the view model up to date. You don't have to keep the DOM up to date. But I want to talk about Backbone, which has a bit of a different approach, as I understand it.
Yeah, it does. So Kendo UI provides an MVVM implementation, and Backbone provides an MV, I don't know what to call that last letter implementation. So a lot of people do call it MVC, but it's not truly MVC. A lot of people use it like MVVM, but it's not truly MVVM. It's a little bit of model view presenter. It's a little bit of, okay, let's stop trying to name it, because honestly, it doesn't really matter what fine detailed name we put into these architecture. It all comes back to we are separating the views architecture into different components, into the display that goes into the DOM, into the behavior that we use to manipulate the DOM and handle user interactions, and then into the data. Sometimes the data and behavior are combined, sometimes they're not. And it kind of comes down to personal preference in terms of which one is better. There really isn't a better solution in my mind. They're all great solutions, MVVM, MVP, MVC, and they just provide different flavors for different personalities and different preferences. So let me load up a Backbone application here. Let's see.
Jim Cowart just he has a name for it.
What's that?
He says it's the model view your mom pattern.
Model view your mom pattern. I also like the model view WTF pattern.
Yeah.
All right, so let me refresh this. All right, so we have the image gallery, the kitty gallery again, except in this case, it's Backbone instead of Kendo UI. So a pretty good
Do you
comparison.
even own a cat? Do you have a cat?
I used to. Sadly, my son is deathly allergic to cats. He accidentally touched our cat when he was about 6 months old and broke out in hives. I mean, it was awful. We had to get
I
rid
am
of the kitty
too.
that week.
I am violently allergic to cats, and let me just be honest and tell you that like my stress level is through the roof with this kitty
You
gallery.
start sneezing just watching my demo
I
here.
know.
All right, so again, I've got the basic. I can enter a placekitten.com/300/205. We'll get a different, oh, come on, give me a different one, 203. There we go. So I hit enter there, and it submitted it through Backbone. But again, it gives me the basics of the same functionality that we saw before. It's just doing it through Backbone instead of through Kendo UI. Now, the code that I have in place here is a little different than I would typically write for Backbone, quite honestly, because this was set up to be a ongoing presentation, start to finish, for a user group sessions and screencasts and things like that. So the basics of a Backbone app are going to look somewhat similar to the Kendo UI, though, in terms of having a view, having behavior inside of that view, and then having data that's bound into the view. But where things get different between Kendo UI and Backbone is you'll see a lot more code inside of Backbone applications, quite honestly. You'll also see that Backbone separates the idea of a view and a model, whereas MVVM gives you a view model as one object. Backbone gives you a view and a model separately. And that has some advantages and some disadvantages. Again, it comes down mostly to personal preference, depending on what you like. But if we look at the add edit form here, you can see that I've got a Backbone view set up. I've got several DOM events in my Backbone to say when I change the URL inside of this input box right here, then go ahead and show the image preview, which I set up by grabbing the URL out of the input box and then changing the source attribute on this image tag right here. And this is one difference between Backbone and Kendo UI's MVVM. All of this is handled through data binding and attributes inside of the MVVM setup. And by default, Backbone doesn't provide that two-way data binding. Of course, there are plugins for that. My personal favorite is one called Backbone.stickit. Um, it's from the team that actually created Backbone in the first place, so you know it's a really well done plugin. But it gives you the ability to do simple bindings similar to an MVVM style, except you declare the bindings in code instead of inside of the HTML like an MVVM pattern does.
So are you binding with the stick are you binding the view to the model?
Yes, you're binding DOM elements information to data from the model, just like you would in MVVM, but here you're using a third-party plugin to do it versus me, I'm just manually doing it right here because
Now
I
let me
just.
ask Derek, one of the things that always confusing me about Backbone is this whole like extend
Mhm.
sort of the way that the syntax works. You know that I understand new backbone view, but this whole what does that mean? What does
So
that extend do?
this is a simplified version of inheritance in JavaScript. This is taking JavaScript's prototypal inheritance and making it a little bit closer to something like Java's extend method or C Sharp's inheritance with the colon in order to inherit from a class. But ultimately, this is not a class definition in a true sense of the word class. If I took this add image view definition and I just remove all of that information, I can say var config equals, paste that right there. This is just a JavaScript object literal, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is literally the definition and implementation of an object in memory right here, assigned to this variable. So I'm taking this object literal to configure my backbone objects, and I'm inheriting and creating a new view type called add image view. And by passing this config into backbone.view.extend, I now have a new view type that I can create instances of that extends from Backbone View, so it has all of Backbone's views built-in behavior, but it has all of my additional behavior and configuration that I've specified right here.
So they could have implemented this like new backbone view, but for whatever reason they chose to go with view.extend to create the new
Well,
instance
new
with
backbone
some
view
basic.
creates an actual instance of the view. So I would say var my view instance equals, and then I can say my view instance dot render, and this gives me the actual view that I can place into the DOM. So I can stuff this into the body, my view instance dot get the DOM element out of the view. So new backbone view gives me an instance of a class, for lack of a better word, a type, a backbone view type. But calling extend inherits from the backbone view in order to give me the ability to create instances of a new type. So one of the differences there is Backbone wants us to extend and create new types, while Kendo UI typically just wants us to create instances of the existing view object and throw our configuration into that directly.
Okay, very interesting. Well, I want to switch gears a little bit here again, and let's talk a little bit about AngularJS because this is another one that's man has it gained some
Yeah.
traction. Golly, I
Oh,
see
it's
this everywhere.
everywhere. It is
Absolutely.
extraordinarily popular, and I have unfortunately not had any time to play with it, so I'm going to be grilling you with questions because I know
I
a
will
lot
do
more about
my
it.
best to answer them, but if I get them wrong, let me go ahead and show my screen here, and you can let me know everything's going well. And of course, we've been working on some integrations for Angular JS and Kendo UI, and I kind of want to take you through what happened to me the first time that I used Angular JS.
Yes,
So I've,
please.
I've got a I've got a
Give me
sample
that
project
hello
here.
world application. I've heard these phrases like controllers and directives, and I have no
Yes.
idea what a directive is. I get a controller because you got model view controller everywhere, but what is a directive, and how does Angular compare to Backbone and Kendo UI SPA?
Yeah. So Angular is an animal all of its own, and it really aims to leverage the power of HTML instead of trying to extract all of the sort of logic. In a lot of SPA implementations, we tend to dumb down HTML because HTML historically was for creating static documents, so it kind of sucks for creating apps.
Right.
And so we're constantly shimming in all this stuff with JavaScript. And so Angular kind of turns the boat around and tries to push a lot of it back into the DOM and let the HTML define what everything is supposed to be doing. So here's a simple application that I've written, and this is a very simple Angular app, but you can see this ng app tag at the top set to sample app, and we'll get to that in a second. And then you can see this ng view area, and so all of the different views, the external views, will be pumped into this ng view area depending on what the route is or the URL is in the bar. So I've got Angular included, jQuery, I've got some Kendo because we're going to use that in a second, and I've got these two files here that are interesting. The first one is app.js. So I'm going to go there and we're going to have a look. And you can see here, let me increase the font size again. So the way that Angular works is it exposes this Angular module or object, excuse me, off of the window. So window.angular is available. And then inside of that you create a module, and you can see I've got this module created, and then in the configuration I'm passing in this route provider, and route provider just provides the functionality for routing inside of AngularJS. So you can see here that I'm doing route provider, and then I'm saying when it's just a slash, then go to this partials / home.html, and those are over. No, let's not do that. Those are just over here in this partials folder here. You can see home and settings. And
okay, so in comparing this to Kendo UI SPA, this would be like the Kendo UI's router.route, except you're calling it when. And then instead of having a view that I've already configured with my template and behavior, you're specifying the template and the controller with behavior right here in the router.
Correct. And so the template comes here, and then the controller you can think of as the view model, although that's not technically correct, and we'll look at the controllers in a minute. But I've got the controllers defined over here, even though they're empty. And you can see them here. I'll pump up the volume here. But these are essentially the view models. And the controllers, the view model is actually the scope object. So anything that you put on the scope object is now available inside of the page. So if I was to put like scope.name equals Derek, I can now reference this name variable in the HTML using the Angular templating syntax. So what happens is when you spin this up, when you fire this up, it goes to the depending on which URL you put in, it loads up that template, and then it binds that template to the controller, for lack of a better word. And then this otherwise is kind of like if you see a URL that you don't recognize, like / your mom, then just go home, because we don't know where else to go instead of going to like a 404. Or you could redirect to right. / your mom.html. So I'm going to fire this up and just kind of show you what it does here. And it doesn't do a lot currently, but this sort of oh, nice. So let me go ahead and set a startup page.
Demo
I know my Visual Studio skills are not what they used to be. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and stop this. Let me go ahead. It's trying to load up. Let's set a start page. There we go. Because this sort of, the way that this works kind of precludes you from doing things the way you would normally do it. So you see home here, and if I change and I go to settings up here in the URL, you'll see that it changes to the settings view.
So is that's a route that you had defined?
That's a route that I had defined, exactly.
Okay.
So if we go back here in the home view, if you remember in the home controller, I added this name. So if I was to come in here and then take out this home and put in name like this, and this is Angular's sort of templating syntax.
Right.
And then save this.
To handlebars and mustache for JavaScript.
Right. And if I have to go back to home, you can see that it's actually now pulling in the name from the controller because it's bound. Yeah. So what is a directive? So the reason why you need directives is what happens here is that you have home and settings, and let's just say we wanted to have a drop-down list on this page. Okay. Now normally when you create a drop-down list, you do something like this, and you might say, I have a list of things here, and we'll just say that it's even a static list of things. So a couple options, thing 1 and thing 2. Now, what you would normally do is this, right? You would think that you could just do this. So I'll just open up a script tag, and I know jQuery and Kendo UI are already there, so I'll just select this thing, and I'll call Kendo dropdown list, right?
Right. I mean,
And
I
that
do that
and
every day.
right, and that seems logical. That's what you would do. But when you do that, you'll notice that you get a select list, but that JavaScript never gets fired.
Really?
Never gets fired. Nope. Because you're loading it in after the fact. The only JavaScript that's going to get fired is on this index page here. So now you have a problem. How are you going to apply your Kendo UI widgets or whatever widgets you have or whatever jQuery plugins you have to the HTML? How are you going to make it something other than boring plain HTML? So the first thought that you may have is, well, in the controller, I could do it here, right? I could say thing and then call Kendo dropdown list. And this would work. Now, the reason why you don't want to do this is because while this works, it feels a little bit dirty, and it feels a little bit dirty because you're accessing the HTML directly from the controller. And the whole concept behind AngularJS is that you set things up so that you can test them. And once you have something tied into the DOM, it becomes very difficult to test.
Because
And so
then you have to have the
usually,
DOM in place in order to run the controller, which means if you
correct.
want to run a test on the controller, well, you got to have the DOM.
Correct, and so it becomes very difficult to test. And I think Michiko, the guy that the father of AngularJS, comes from a testing background,
Right.
and so he designed the library to be very, very testable. And JavaScript libraries in general in the past, it's been very difficult to test because of this exact problem.
Yeah,
So
even back when
normally
we
what would
used.
happen here is that you would pass a reference to the DOM into the controller, right? So you would be looking for. So the first thing that I did was I was like, well, surely on the scope there's some sort of reference to the DOM. There's not. The
Hmm.
controller is completely agnostic of the DOM at all. It does not know that they exist. So then you kind of think, well, how in the world am I going to use Kendo UI with AngularJS?
Yeah.
And the answer is you're going to use something called a directive. So I'm going to go ahead and include those, and we'll see how that works. So let me go ahead here and include my directive in the page here. Put this right after Kendo, and let me find it here. This is Angular Kendo. You can see there's a lot of different, there's Angular Bootstrap, Angular Mocks,
Right.
Angular Resource for HTTP calls. So once I've got this in here, I need to come over and then add it in here. And I know that it's kendo.directives. We've got some good documentation on this. But this just tells my main module here, hey, I want you to compile and parse these directives on the HTML. Right? So including the file is not enough. You got to pass it into the module as well.
Okay.
And what this does is, what directives do is, this is a directive right here. So Angular traverses the DOM, and then it looks for tags that it recognizes. And it has some built in, like ngView, ngRepeat, for repeating over collections of data. And in our case, over here on the home, and let me increase the font size here. We know that this JavaScript isn't going to execute, and so instead we need a directive that tells AngularJS, hey, this is a Kendo UI dropdown list. But
Right.
remembering that we're never going to get a chance to access this with JavaScript. And so what the directive allows you to do is come out here and say Kendo dropdown list. And a lot of people have asked me, they're like, why are there so many freaking dashes? And the reason is that if you do Kendo dropdown list, right, like this,
Uh-huh.
and that's set as a data attribute, the HTML5 data attributes.
Right.
When you get that in JavaScript, it gets parsed as a dash,
Okay.
and vice versa. And so when we get this on the other side, and when the directive, which is actually going to run the JavaScript for us and create it, when it gets this dash separated list, this is what it's going to get. It doesn't actually get a dash separated list. It gets that right
Gotcha.
there, which is exactly what we want.
Right,
So,
because our
but
Kendo UI controls, we use that camel case like you just showed in order to run everything.
correct. And I'm open to changing the API some to make it a little bit less dashy, but right now that's straightforward, and that's kind of the logic behind that. Now, once I save this, let me come back out here to the application, refresh, and hopefully, oh, I got an error here. Let me check things out. Nothing like live coding. No module Kendo directives. Let me see here. Maybe it's sometimes I get let me clear my cache here. Let's see, clear browser cache.
Do you need to restart the
All
server?
right. Yeah, I do. I think you're right, man. I shouldn't need to, but we'll
There
see.
you go.
Although, oh man,
Yay!
yeah. So I've got some sort of error in my live coding example here. Let's see. I've got see Angular Kendo Web, jQuery. Ah, you know what? I bet you it included. Let's see. I got jQuery from NuGet, and I don't want that version. I want 1.9.1.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go out here to JSBin. And everybody does know JSBin's a great place to go play with Kendo UI. You can just come down here and say add Kendo UI Q2, and you get all the scripts.
Nice.
It's a great place. Yeah, it's really nice. Good boilerplate for starting off. So let
Yeah.
me come in here and just replace this script tag, and we'll see if that's enough to do it. And if not, we'll bail on this demo. Let's see. Am I pulling in 1.9.1 now? Yeah, I'm still pulling in 1.9.1. So I somehow have managed to get things misconfigured so that it's
All right.
not working, but the way that this should work is that this directive gets parsed by AngularJS and gives you a Kendo UI dropdown list instead.
Right.
And directives are something that the Angular picks up and it compiles and then it uses those and it looks for these special tags. And so this is just the concept of pushing the definition of the behavior back onto the HTML. And it additionally supports things like, ng-click. So you have things like ng-click, and then you can point this to some function that you have on the scope. So you could say
Right.
clicky, right, like that, and then you would come over to your controller and you would add in. Remember, scope's like your view model. Anything that you put on the scope is accessible from the DOM into a function, and then you could do something here, something awesome. So that's essentially how AngularJS works, and of course I've got everything's kind of messed up now. I'm not sure what I did wrong there, but that should give you an idea of how Angular sort of thinks about the world, and it's kind of a mind shift. It really is. Although
Yeah.
it's very similar to Kendo UI, and it's sort of declarative. Kendo UI has declarative initialization,
Right.
which allows you to define things with roles and properties in the HTML. And there's kind of two different schools of thought on this. Some people love it. Some people makes them feel very uncomfortable and they don't like it because they're like, hey, didn't we used to do something like this? Like, didn't we used to do this?
Constantly.
Right? And the people are like, no, 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 don't ever do that.
Put your
Unobtrusive
JavaScript
JavaScript.
elsewhere.
Right, put JavaScript elsewhere. So how is this different from that? And so there's a little bit of debate because they are similar. But the idea here is just make the HTML work for you. And I like declarative initialization, so I like AngularJS. I feel like when you look at an application, you got to maintain it. This right here, and specifically the example I give a lot is this. So you may have something that looks like this. And over in your JavaScript, you may select this div and turn it into a Kendo UI calendar. Well, the
Right.
problem with that is that when I go, that's not a calendar, that's a div.
Right.
A div is not a calendar, a div is a div. And so what Angular allows you to do is you can even do it with elements, is you could do like that. Now that makes a whole lot more sense to me. I
That
know that
does.
that's a calendar widget just by looking at the HTML.
It does. So this
So
seems to be very much heading in the direction that I think of when I think about the upcoming standard of web components.
yes, absolutely. And so web components, and this is something the Polymer project, and the idea with web components is that you have tags like this in the
Right.
HTML, and so you can sort of add in functionality into your HTML, and then it's built into the browser. It's part of the browser. It's not
Right.
a JavaScript library that you're adding on. And so AngularJS actually sets us up really, really well for web components, which are coming. Google's on board. I know Firefox is on board, and I think Microsoft is on board as well. Um, and so it's coming, and this sets us up well for that, and kind of begins to change our mind shift in the way that we've done things in the past.
Very nice.
So I want to switch from this and go to one more demo, and this is another Kendo UI SPA demo. Now this is an MVC application on steroids. It's using a couple of libraries here, but you can see I've got some controllers here, and what this is it's an Instagram viewer, but it's a rather large application, and it's using the Kendo UI SPA framework. It's also using Twitter Bootstrap. It's using the flat UI for Twitter Bootstrap, which is a really
Okay.
nice add-in. It's using Font Awesome. It's using CoffeeScript. I know, right? Like who
Hipster,
says
hipster.
who says you can't be a total hipster inside of Visual Studio? You totally can.
Definitely.
It's using Web Essentials to cross-compile. It uses less. And I've had a lot of fun building this application, but I'm going to go ahead and run this and kind of show you what it does, and then we'll talk about exactly how this is put together, because it is a rather large application. So when you first log in, the application really has two pages. It has the app, and then it has this other page. It's like, I don't know who you are.
Right.
And so you authenticate, and it posts, makes a call back to the server. The server authenticates with Instagram, and then sends you to the application once you've authenticated with Instagram using OAuth, and all that's handled by C# on the server tier, and then it hopefully will redirect you to the application. Man, I'm just having all kinds of trouble here today.
Or it'll crash.
Or it'll crash. Let's try this again here. Let's stop this and try again. If not, I've got a running sample that should be, yeah. So here's my running sample. Let me go ahead and refresh this and see if we can pull in a fresh list of posts here. Let me stop that. Wow. Man, demo fail is so great, especially since I was running this
Right.
like literally 5 seconds before we started the webcast.
Right. All right, so let's go ahead and skip this. It's a great demo. You've showed it to me before. The thing that I love about it is the use of require.js. But there's a lot of really good questions that I'm seeing over here in the Q&A section. So let's go ahead and skip straight over to those. And I'm going to run down the list and start going through some of these questions. So the first question I see is, does Kendo UI SPA easily integrate with Google Analytics? And I don't know about easily, quite honestly, but I know it does. Google Analytics provides a lot of capability to handle JavaScript and single-page applications. It typically requires a little more JavaScript on your part in order to get the event handlers for the Google Analytics in place. But it actually does support that, and that's Google Analytics that supports it. So I've used Google Analytics with some backbone code before, and it wasn't terribly difficult to do. Oh, you got it running.
Yeah, well, I have an instance that's set up on Azure.
Okay,
you can
great.
see here. So this is it. When you go to so I can click on somebody's name here, and you'll see that the content gets swapped out.
Right.
And this will get pulled in here in a second, and then new content gets dropped in, and this is all using the Kendo UI SPA framework.
Very nice.
And using Bootstrap, and of course, yeah, everything and as I go back here, if I click this, you'll see the view gets swapped out, and I get taken right back. If I go here, I can view my photos, and all of this is getting pulled in. And I think my problems have to do with timing. My internet is just really dog slow.
Could be.
And so all of this, and another interesting thing about this app is I tried really hard to make it responsive so that as you scale down, that it continues. You can see my comment isn't quite there, but as you get down to phone size here, that it still maintains this very readable and everything stacks.
Nice.
And yeah, and as I go over here, everything continues to look normal like it should. And this content will update here in a second.
So did you have to do anything on the JavaScript to get that responsive nature, or is this all just like media queries with CSS?
Yeah, I just used the Twitter Bootstrap's kind of responsive, and I used Kendo UI list views, which are great for kind of repeating sets of data. And that's what I used to do this. Now, one interesting thing about this application is that it does use require.js because there's a lot of code here.
Yeah.
And I wanted to take a look at that just a second. kind of look at how that works. So there's a main file here, and you can see the main file. Essentially, what it does is it defines that I'm going to use jQuery, Kendo UI, Bootstrap, and I'm actually using SignalR here as well, even though it's not doing anything technically right now. Specifying the dependencies for those libraries, and then I'm basically saying, okay, load all of that stuff up, and then execute this file. And this file is here. And you can see in the app, I've defined this container element, which is where everything happens in the app. It's basically everything below the nav bar.
Right.
And then here's my router. Let me update on this. And again, this is CoffeeScript. You can see the JavaScript over on the right-hand side, although I cannot change the font size there. But you can see I'm handling the routes. And then just like you talked about here, I'm getting the ID for an image, and then using the layout and showing and loading up different views. And each one of my views is actually contained here in this mylibs folder. And so each view, like if we take the main feed view, it's here, and you can see my template is here as well. And I actually use the require.js text plugin here to load in, let me see here. I actually use the text plugin to load in my HTML here, and then I pass that directly into the template. And so what this allows me to do, go ahead.
So in my examples, I was pulling my templates directly out of the DOM, and you've avoided the DOM interaction, which is a really expensive thing to do, by using this text plugin.
Exactly. And the text plugin, what it does is it just pulls it in using an AJAX request, and then shows it in the page. Now,
so
when I go
to pull that every time, or does it cache it?
It caches. It caches it. So the way require.js works is it loads it once, and then if you ask for it again, it just goes and gets it. Now, when I actually deploy this to production, I would go through the require.js build process, which we blogged about on the Kendo UI blogs. And what that does is it takes all of the JavaScript that I've got here and all of the HTML, and it slams it into one file that I then stick in the page, and then I'm not making an XHR call for my templates anymore. They're actually JavaScript strings, which are loaded in. Yeah, so it's really convenient. This is a great way to structure your code when you start getting into huge applications. And I know one of the quotes that I picked up from you that I think was from Justin Meyer is that when you build the secret to building large JavaScript applications is don't ever build a large JavaScript application. Build small pieces and then assemble those pieces into a larger structure.
Exactly.
To create the application.
Exactly, and I love that quote because it's so dead on to everything that I like to do with development. And I loved how Angular was heading down in that direction with the idea of components, basically. And I even do the same thing with my backbone applications and my Kendo UI applications. I try to build those individual pieces that can just be composed into larger pages and such a functionality.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another one that another sort of concept here is Nicholas Zakis talks a lot about this, and he talks about thinking of your application as being modular. And so, you know, in the example of this application, it's not really as much modular as it is separated, but each one of these views is a module. But inside of this view, this could be a module here, and then each one of these pictures could be a module in and of itself if it had behavior. Maybe a better example is here. This could be a module, and then this comments could be a module. This likes here could be a module, and then this could be a module. And the idea here is that you create these modules, and then I should be able to drop this on any page, and it should just work. And if it has interactions with other modules, that should be done via some messaging pattern. And so I should be able to take this comments and drop it somewhere, and it should just work. And if it doesn't just work, then it should definitely not break.
Right. That's a very important aspect. You should really have these things walled off like that, so that because I have that problem a lot where I'll go into an application that I've been working on, and I'll have one line of code that's broken in one place, and the entire page will be gone. When it really should only affect that one piece of the screen, that one module.
Right, exactly. And I think that's one of those things where you do it and you're like, this isn't really that big of a deal. Right? Like I'm going to reference the DOM here and it's not going to be that big of a deal. But then later on down the road, you realize you have to go to change something and then it breaks everything because it's so rigid. The app just becomes so rigid.
Tightly coupled and...
Right. And that's especially a problem in JavaScript where the tooling, while better, is not as great as a static analysis where it's like, oh, hey, you're referencing an object that doesn't exist, where JavaScript's like, hey, whatever you want to do, man.
Right.
It doesn't tell you.
Yeah.
So let me get to some questions here. I'm gonna go
Yeah,
ahead
I've
and
got a couple of more
pause.
questions lined up here, some really good ones. Give me 1 second. So there's a question. As a .NET developer, I'm feeling disconnected from what you're showing, Mac, Jade, Node.js, etc. How is this relevant to .NET MVC? Well, I think your demos, Burke, showed some of that relevancy. You had Angular and Kendo UI running in Visual Studio on top of even ASP.NET web forms for the Angular project, and then MVC for the InstaSharp here. But more appropriately, the better answer to that question is that the back-end technology doesn't really matter that much. Even though we are choosing our own personal preferences for the back end, I could build any of these applications on Rails, PHP, ASP.NET MVC, or whatever I choose, because it's all just JavaScript and HTML that runs in the browser at the end of the day. So the back end is entirely up to you. Pick what you like as the back end. Just create the necessary APIs that the JavaScript wants to use.
Right, and I think Joe brings up a good point, and that's essentially that as developers we're very comfortable with a certain technology, and when we see
Right.
other technology, especially me, I see Vim and I don't understand Vim. I'm not a Vim user, although I do spend most of my time on a Mac. But it doesn't matter what's on the server, but I do think that it helps, hopefully it helped to see some of the stuff in Visual Studio and understand how that works.
Right.
He asked another great question, which is that Kendo Calendar is not a valid HTML element,
Mm-hmm.
and Visual Studio is telling you. Why is this okay? That is a fantastic question.
And that's a question I hear a lot about AngularJS.
Yes, and I think this is kind of a religious debate, but my take on this is that we kind of got to this place where like your HTML should validate,
Right.
and if it doesn't validate, then that's not okay. But the truth of the matter is that by the time it gets output or gets run through Angular, it is valid HTML. So the output is valid HTML. The markup to get there is not. Is that okay? It's not in a perfect world, no. But inside the bounds of what we're working with, yes. And that's why web components is so compelling, because then
Yeah.
they will validate, and those will be valid attributes, and we
Right.
won't be mutating the DOM the way that we do now with AngularJS.
Right. So the other side of that big giant gray area is, well, we're already using script tags to contain templates, and our templates don't have valid HTML 100%. We have all of these really strange characters in there that would just show garbage on the screen, but they get run through a template engine. So the Angular directives and that Kendo calendar tag that you had created there is kind of analogous to that. It's just using a different area of the browser and web technology in order to get it done. But I think your idea of moving toward web components there is really spot on to why, okay, if you're comfortable with this not validating in your IDE, then this is a really good option.
Right, absolutely.
So there was another question about Kendo UI templates here. It says, how come you can find the template just by using the ID name, i.e. Kitty Gallery template, rather than using a jQuery selector, i.e. hashtag Kitty Gallery template?
That's a great
And
question.
that comes down entirely to the Kendo UI rendering, template rendering. When we specify a Kendo UI view, and I gave it that Kitty Gallery template ID, um, the Kendo UI code quite literally checks to see if there is a hash in front of it. And if there isn't, it adds one there for me in order to do the selector. So it's really just a little bit of convenience for me. The Kendo UI code says, okay, I don't absolutely need you to put the hash on there because I can check for the existence of that for you and just move on.
So Rob Lauer, our good friend Rob, had asked about comparing and contrasting the Kendo UI SPA framework with the mobile framework. He does a lot of mobile work, and his question was like, I don't have to define routers in my mobile application, which is a fantastic question. And the answer to that is that the Kendo UI SPA framework is actually derived from the mobile framework, which has had this SPA framework all along. It
Right.
just wasn't really advertised that way. It's just Kendo UI Mobile, and so all of this happens under the covers. Kendo UI Mobile has the concept of views and
Mm-hmm.
layouts in the markup, and then it has a router behind the scenes, and it sort of glues all of those pieces together for you in a
Right.
very specific way.
Right. The
The
Kendo
Kendo
UI
U,
Mobile is very tightly integrated in order to get the performance improvements that it needs on constrained devices.
right, exactly. And I get that question a lot. People ask me, can we make Kendo UI Mobile work with AngularJS? And my question to them is, is that what do you get that you don't have from the Kendo UI Mobile framework? And the answer is really that they just want to build their mobile app with AngularJS, and that's a completely legitimate reason. The reason why Kendo UI Mobile is so opinionated is because performance on mobile devices is so quirky, and that's at best. That's
Right.
at best. And
Yeah.
so the guys on the engineering team have spent a year and a half pouring through profiles, profiling code, profiling bugs in CSS, and when Kendo UI Mobile can control the application from front to back, then it has a much better chance of giving you top-notch performance if it can
Right.
control all of that.
Yeah, across all of the different devices that we
Right.
support. It's not
Exactly.
limited to a subset. I mean, we do Windows Phone 8, we do Android, we do iOS, we even do BlackBerry. So
Right.
it's across the board here. So a couple of more good questions here from Igor. One question, it would be great to know more about Kendo UI SPA. Do we need Angular and Backbone if we use Kendo? And the answer to that is a definite no. You don't need anything other than Kendo UI, but you can if you want to. So I've got a link here that I'm pasting into um, the chat window for a getting started resource set for the Kendo UI SPA, which will show you how to use Kendo UI front to back with our SPA components and building your own application. However, we do have a lot of great integration with other libraries like Backbone and Angular and even Knockout. And if you head over to labs.kendoui.com, which I'll paste into the window again, HTTP, you can get all of the different project integrations that we have for Backbone and Angular and everything else. So you can use all of Kendo UI or just the UI components, the controls, the calendar, the grids, etc., on top of these other great SPA frameworks. And then one other question from Igor. Is it possible to have Kendo templates or views in separate files? And absolutely, yes, it is. And I love doing it that way. The demos that I showed today had everything in one file because they were halfway done demos for screencasts. But as Burke showed with his InstaSharp application, we can easily put that information in separate files. And you don't even have to use require.js to do that. You can just include the JavaScript files and the HTML templates directly in your DOM output through server-side includes and other pieces like that. With Kendo UI Mobile, there's such a thing as a remote view as well, where the framework itself recognizes that a view is stored on the server and it has to go grab that whenever it's referenced. So there's a lot of different options for the different pieces in Kendo UI that allow you to separate all of the code and view templates and everything else into different files.
I'm actually showing my screen again. That was a great answer, Derek. I'm actually showing my screen again because, and I lost somebody in here was like, bro, Robert. Robert's like, buddy, you got to include jQuery before Angular, and he's exactly right. That's why.
Okay,
It's
awesome.
exactly why it wasn't working. But just to go ahead and show everybody what this looks like now, you get a drop-down list, right? And so you're able to,
Very nice.
I go over here to your right settings, then it changes the view, and then it comes back, and there's no JavaScript per se, right? Everything is happening based on the directive, is taking care of making that into a drop-down list. So thank you, Robert, for your debugging skills. Appreciate that.
So one last question here, or comment, I guess. To counter Igor's question of separating files, Joe is asking or saying, I don't like so many separate files. It makes support very hard to do. The code is hard to read and follow. And I agree, in production, it's very bad to have separate files like that. You end up with a massive amount of overhead trying to download all of these different files. In development, okay, personal preference. Some people do like them separate, some people don't. But in production mode, you definitely do want to run some sort of concat and minify process for your JavaScript and even for your templates. And if you're using a compiled template language, then you'll want to run a pre-compiler for your templates before you ship this thing off to your production environment. And just to advertise our tooling a little bit more, we have a tool called the Kendo Bootstrapper, which helps to do a lot of that for you when working with Kendo UI. It gives you things like JSLint to tell you that you have problems in your JavaScript, or Kendo lint to tell you that you have configuration problems with your Kendo code, and it will compile, concatenate, and minify all of your files for you so that you can go into a production environment a lot easier and only have the one file to reduce the amount of download for a given project.
Yeah, so definitely check that out. I mean, we've had grunt tasks and node packages for a
Yes.
long time. This is sort of a visual representation of all of that that allows you to
It's a
point and
very
click your way
visual
to.
tool. There's a lot of great information on the blog about that, and you can find it through the labs.kendoui.com link as well.
All right, well, I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We're 6 minutes over. Derek, thanks for joining today and enlightening us with your SPA expertise.
Always a pleasure.
All right, we will have this recording available later on YouTube. We'll probably do a follow-up blog post. And thank you, everybody, for joining. I'd love to know from people, what I'm going to stop the recording here, but get a couple last comments on if we do another tech chat, what would people like to see us talk about? Should we talk about the Bootstrapper? Should we talk about more labs projects? Should we talk about best practices in Kendo UI applications? Should we talk about mobile, data viz? I mean, we definitely want to talk about the things that you're interested in and that you want to see. So, all right, thanks everybody. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you.
Adios.